So now that you're here and Mr. Madison is here, we can officially hit record and get started. Welcome, everybody. It's so exciting to have you in class today. My name is Kari Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And today's class is all about James Madison, the ratification of the United States Constitution, and some great reads called the Federalist Papers. So for class today, we are partnering with Colonial Williamsburg, and we are so excited to have them as an educational partner with the National Constitution Center. And we're here with James Madison and the President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, Jeffrey Rosen. So Jeff, I know that James Madison is one of your favorite people to talk to, so I'm going to turn this over to you to let you get started. But students, ask questions, put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and Jeff and I will do our best to get them to Mr. Madison. So over to you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Curry. And hi, friends. It's so great to see everyone. Mr. Madison, it is wonderful to see you. Happy Constitution Day. We were here just recently with you at the National Constitution Center. And I want to begin by asking you, why did you and your fellow delegates come to Philadelphia in 1787? I'll note that we just had a great discussion with you on Friday where you emphasized a fear of mob violence, of the fact that there were mobs in Western Massachusetts attacking the courthouses because they didn't want to pay their debts. And that led you to say in Federalist 10 that you wanted to avoid the danger of faction, any group, either a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. Tell us about that fear of mobs and why it brought you to Philadelphia.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen, and a pleasure to see you as well in so short a span of time. There is not one singular event that sparked the true fear and necessity of that business in Philadelphia in 1787. We might speak to the rebellion of Mr. Shays as the most recent example. And yet, a great many congressmen can well recall the events early in the 1780s where soldiers, unpaid for the mingled blood they shed, stormed and threatened to storm Congress, were it not for the intervention of President Washington and great speeches he made, very well could have led to open rebellion. And so from the course of that, it became apparent that something more was necessary, a sanction of law, or inevitably a sanction of blood. Now, it is important to remember that a great many of those representatives who attended the business in Philadelphia came under the assumption that they were going to render our previous system of government, the Articles of Confederation, adequate. Very few were apprised of the real truth that a new system of government would be introduced. After years of research, I had already reached the conclusion that it would be far superior to ingrain the old qualities into a new system rather than to place new qualities into an old system. For what have we witnessed over the course of human history? We witnessed the great danger in the equation of power in government is not giving enough power at the start, but rather slowly granting power over time. Now, it's important to remember when we look to the history of democracy and republican forms of government, that democracies functioning upon a small scale are ever prone to faction. And the great desideratum of government moves to how we check that faction. Now, the first method by which we do this is to check the causes of faction. The second, inevitably, is to treat the outcome of faction. Now, faction cannot be suppressed because inevitably in doing so, you rob the liberty that ought to belong to all in government. So instead, in treating the outcome of faction, you extend the sphere of government. Such was the case in Philadelphia. So for instance, you have the rebellion of Mr. Shays, highly concentrated in Massachusetts. Upon the scale of Massachusetts as a republic in and of itself, that rebellion of Mr. Shays becomes much more detrimental. It becomes a mob with real threat of overthrowing that government of Massachusetts. But if we look to an extended federal republic, suddenly you have an extended larger territory where that singular mob while dangerous in the province of Massachusetts, does not affect the federal government as it operates in other provinces. Placing democracy in an experiment of government ever comes with its risk. And there were a great many delegates in Philadelphia who were apprehensive at the notion of placing such democratic principles, such power in government into the hands of the people. It has been the sentiment through the course of the majority of human history that to the principle that government can function by the will of society. And so in that vein, the question then becomes how to ingrain the principles of democracy into a republican form of government to ensure that reason can pervade, regardless of whether enlightened statesmen are at the helm.
Fascinating. What a wonderful introduction to the central principles of the Constitution. And you've just reminded us that although some of the authorities that you read before coming to the convention, like Montesquieu, thought that you could only have democracy in small republics because people would know each other and be sensitive to the common good, your great insight was that a large republic might be more effective for America because it would be harder for factions or passionate mobs to discover each other. And by the time they did, passions would cool and reason would prevail. So you said the central purpose of the Constitution was to ensure the rule of reason rather than passion. And as you wrote in the Federalist Papers, to see if government by deliberation and choice rather than chance and violence could prevail. Tell us about the other mechanisms that you embodied in the Constitution to ensure the rule of reason rather than passion, beginning perhaps with the separation of powers.
Absolutely, Mr. Rosen, a beautiful summation. Now, it was Montesquieu who first put forward the notion of a separation of powers. Now, previous philosophers had enumerated the various branches of government, but Montesquieu, in his spirit of laws, put forward the notion that wherever the power is concentrated in one singular branch of government, you can have only tyranny. Now, the examples put forward by Montesquieu were enumerated in the previous systems of government, like that of the British Parliament, where you have a House of Commons, a House of Lords, as well as executive power. Now, long in that constitutional monarchy had the various branches been respected and separate. And to that, we might look to the previous systems of government that we had, say, in the colony of Virginia, where you had, since 16 and 19, a House of Burgesses functioning alongside a privy council of state and some governor or executive in that capacity. And yet we witnessed in 1775 what and how easily it might be taken place where one branch can hold dominion over the other. Our last royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, in dissolving the House of Burgesses, made himself, in summary, a petty tyrant by overseeing the affairs of the adjudicative branch of government, the executive branch of government, and a vacuum being put in place by the absence of the legislature, inevitably placing all power within that hand. And so it is not only important that each branch should become autonomous in and of itself, but that there is an investment in interest within the subsequent functions of those equal branches. So, for example, in that respect, we witness in the Constitution of 1776 with the Commonwealth of Virginia, the establishment of a separation of powers, but a separation where there is no vested interest in the function of those other subsequent powers. This is in part what made the executive branch of Virginia in the time of the conflict with Great Britain so incredibly misfunctional in its capacity. Which is why in the enumeration of the Virginia plan of government, we see not only the separation of powers, but ambition being made to counteract ambition, a relationship betwixt how state legislature might operate, how federal legislature might operate, in the apportionment of Article 1, how the Senate is appointed. But equally, you see a counteraction between the more popular House, the House of Representatives, and the more deliberate House, the Senate, which has a longer term, which functions with the executive in the ratification of treaties. You have a judiciary branch, which at all times is appointed by the executive, although That was put forward somewhat later in the Judiciary Act of 1789, enumerating the various policies and rules by which the judiciary branch may operate. But in the sum and in summation of that, you have not only a system of separate powers, autonomous in their own capacity, but a system of checks and balances where there is an investment in a common interest for the whole of the system to function. Now, as I said, we may hope that enlightened statesmen may be at the helm, a statesman devoted to the public virtue and patriotism warranted by such a notable cause. And yet how our Constitution is designed ensures that if virtue is not at the helm, if reason is not at the helm, the system of government may still function based upon man's interest. That is, I think, in some regards, the genius of the system.
Thank you very much for that, that summation. You mentioned the Virginia plan at the convention. And of course, as you suggested, that was the proposal that you helped to draft by Virginia and the larger states, that the Constitution create a legislature with two houses, both of which were elected by the people, because you thought popular representation was important. But the smaller states disagreed. And in the New Jersey plan, your fellow delegate, Mr. Patterson, proposed that each state be given one vote, as under the Articles of Confederation. And the compromise was the Connecticut Compromise that Mr. Sherman proposed, that said that the House should be popularly elected, but in the Senate, each state should get 2 votes. Tell us about that crucial debate about how to structure the legislature and how and why you chose the Connecticut Compromise rather than the Virginia or the New Jersey plans.
A very, very notable and very good question. Under the previous system of government, the people had very little will into the affairs of the federal system of government, no interest in it. Our congressmen were appointed by the very subsequent state legislatures. And though it might seem equitable, every state within Congress had equal representation and an equal vote. And that would function well if every state had the same population, had the same number of populations, had the same geographic territory. Such has never been the case. And what we witnessed over the course of those 10 years was, in the small states, the great fear of the dominion of the many, of Massachusetts, of New York, of Pennsylvania, circumscribing the will of the smaller states, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Delaware. This led to great resistance, the pervading bite of jealousy between the various states. And so the question became, how do you put forward the notion of popular sovereignty while ensuring the interest of every state is met, and that equity, which ought to be the basis of government, should reign supreme? Now, it is true, under the Virginia plan, both houses were to be elected by the people at large. And so from there, such compromises allowed inevitably for both measures to prevail, where the will of the people may be heard while simultaneously the interest of the state can continue to be heard.
Thank you so much for that. Let's talk now about the compromises over the election of the president. There were different views. You and some others proposed initially that the legislature should choose the president. Mr. Wilson of Pennsylvania, the most ardent advocate of popular sovereignty, thought the president should be popularly elected. Mr. Hamilton, who favored a president so strong that some accused him of being a secret monarchist, wanted a president elected for life. And the ultimate compromise was the Electoral College, the complicated system where the states would authorize the appointment of electors who in turn would choose the president. And of course, many delegates thought that that would mean the Electoral College in most cases would fail to produce a majority winner, and the elections would really be decided by the House. So that would be a popular check. And that's not, of course, the way things turned out. The Electoral College is so confusing to many people today. Tell us more about the compromises and debates that led to its creation.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen. It's true, within the Virginia plan of government, the initial desire was that the chief magistrate, however it would function, whether it would be a triumvirate of people, 7 people, or what would eventually pervade one individual, how it would be elected. And now Congress had previously appointed the president of the Congress, which functioned more like a speaker of the House in its faculties and capacity, not as a proper executive. But there was a great fear that the chief magistrate, in being elected by Congress, would inevitably make that individual beholden to Congress. In doing so, becoming a puppet of that vested and interested party. The fear in that was that the separation of powers would become muddied in that vein. So the question became, how then shall a chief magistrate be appointed? Now, here are the dilemmas of a president being elected by a people at large. One, the continent of North America, and particularly the 13 states, is a large geographic swath of people with, at the time of our revolution, some 17 million persons upon it. Now, it is a great misfortune that there is likely only one individual notorious enough for their virtue and for their principles to have the confidence of a whole of a continent. And alas, regardless of what some may think, General Washington will not live forever. So how then should a chief magistrate be chosen if a people cannot acquaint themselves enough with the person's principles, with their virtue, with their identity? So something more is necessary. Now, the second dilemma of allowing the people at large to choose a chief magistrate is that here at this present moment, there is no system of universal suffrage. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, for the longest of times, to be eligible for the franchise, you must be wealthy, white, a property owner, unmortgaged, the holder of some 25 acres of land, refined, 50 unrefined. And prior to the various statutes that reformed it, you must be Protestant. And so every state had its own laws for the enfranchisement of a people, voting laws. So since there is an inequity between the various voting laws, you cannot hold truth that a chief magistrate should have the full confidence of a whole of the people. Now, you might turn to the state legislatures for a vote for the chief magistrate, and yet in doing so, you simultaneously muddy the waters within the vested interest of the state legislatures. So then it must be a separate body. In such democratic experiments of government, you must check democracy while ensuring democracy may reign supreme. You must form tributaries and canals whereby the waters of popular sovereignty may flow. So you utilize the same system which had been previously used, a separate body appointed by a people who were elected by the people to ensure that there is equity amongst the states, to ensure that each state is upon equal footing. Now, you also check state identity. For when the Electoral College was crafted, electors received 2 votes, one for someone who resided in their state and one for someone who resided without. This checks the partisan identity that oftentimes is found between the subsequent states. And lastly, you ensure that whosoever receives the majority of the votes shall become president. Whosoever receives the second number of votes shall become vice president. In that, you have another check betwixt ambition. 2 individuals who, in such regards, competed or vied for the same position, now put forward with the vested interest of collaborating together. The vice president becoming inevitably the president of the Senate, working in collaboration with the chief magistrate. Now, it was the expectation that inevitably the decision would fall to Congress. However, the channels put in place checked that great fear that inevitably Congress should receive dominion over the presidency by placing greater weight into the hands of those electors.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask about one last crucially important compromise at the convention, and then we'll turn things over to Curry to field the great questions that are in the Q&A box. And thank you, friends, for submitting them. And of course, the final compromise I'm going to ask you about is the compromise over slavery. You insisted that the word slavery not be inscribed in the Constitution because you wanted to make sure that the Constitution did not explicitly sanction the idea that there could be property in man, as you put it. And at the same time, there were a series of infamous compromises that tacitly acknowledged the existence of slavery and refused to ban it. And those included the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause, and the clause that prohibited Congress from banning the importation of slaves until 1808. Tell us about those compromises.
All right, thank you, Mr. Rosen. The institution of slavery has ever been a masterpiece of circumlocution. It is how we can put forward in our American Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And through our words, by justifying that all men must exist in a sphere of society, and that those, because of a mere distinction of color, exist outside the sphere of society, that we can delineate and, by a peculiarity of color, justify man as property. Now, it is true, I say you cannot find property in men. I put forward that the notion that we see in this enlightened age, the mere distinction of color, the justification for the most oppressive dominion of man over man. And yet simultaneously, though I've tried to find some form of vocation as independent of the institution of slavery as possible, my family has held some over 100 souls in a condition of property. It is their toil upon the fields which gives me the luxury of being here today, the privilege of being here today. And so from there, we are faced with the great condition, the great expectation that slavery will, over time, wean itself away from this American experiment. But the far more pervading question is, what then shall we do with the racial prejudice that justifies the holding of man in bondage? And so when we address this question as it came up in the convention, we need not only look to those who support and defend the institution of slavery, but those who simultaneously, because of a racial prejudice, do not wish to see the population of Blacks count the same as the population of whites. So at the convention, it was a particular interest of the Southerners to have their enslaved and their property or whatsoever other persons count towards the representation. This gives greater representation for the Southern cause within America, a Southern cause which continually wished for the right to hold man in bondage. It was the sentiment of one Mr. Pinckney at the convention, that he would not support any document which did not guarantee in some respects the right to hold individuals in bondage. While simultaneously you had delegates like Luther Martin, who wished to see an abolition to what he called the hellish traffic of enslaved peoples into America. And so there was a vested interest upon both sides to address what role will the institution of slavery play in this extended experiment of government. Now, the ratio that was eventually arrived at, the 3/5 of other persons, was not a new ratio. It had been passed in various other state legislatures. And yet it was one that inevitably did placate both parties. And you had the sentiments of fellow Virginians like Colonel Mason, who said that though the full representation of such individuals benefited his cause, he could not inevitably allow the Black voice to count the same as the white. It became clarion over the course of the convention that the topic of slavery, if continued to move down, would become the grounds by which the whole of the convention and the whole of the Union would crumble. I spoke out over the course of that summer in 1787, when the fear was brought forward by the small states that there would be a division amongst large and small, and that it was far more likely that there would be a division betwixt North and South, all upon the grounds in the institution of slavery. And so from there, while we might deem that the 3/5 compromise, the compromise that was reached, was a victory in that capacity, The various clauses put forward, while the mention of the word slave is not within it, do prove problematic on some grounds, not only sustaining the institution, but leaving it towards the future and future hands to rid the various problems and contradictions that we find with now. It is my sincere hope that if a people are enlightened, that we, over the course of time, may see the gradual steps requisite. And yet, I will say, Mr. Rosen, if faced with the question of the abolition of the institution of slavery and the preservation of the Union, I will every time preserve and prefer the latter.
Thank you for your candor in those thoughts. We have all sorts of great questions in the Q&A box. Curry, I know you're fielding them. Why don't you share some highlights with Mr. Madison?
There are a lot of great questions, and I agree with you, Jeff. Thank you for answering that so holistically, and it gives us insight. But so many of the questions in the chat box are ranging around the Federalist Papers. So if you don't mind, Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers. So I would love to ask you a few questions about those. Catherine wanted to know a little bit more about your reaction to Brutus's first paper, so Brutus 1, and this idea that is set forth, which they believe it's Robert Yates, but not 100% sure. So can you speak to that?
Which specific idea within Mr. Brutus's papers?
The idea that the states should be their own countries and in standing on their own, really going back to that counter that you have with the nationalism.
Yes. So in that, we see again Montesquieu's spirits pervade. Every system of government has a spirit which predominates through it. May not government be properly divided based upon those spirits into three separate species: a government that operates by permanent military force, a government that operates by corrupt influence, a government that operates and derives its energy from the will of society. Here is the great danger in leaving sovereignty to the individual states and complete autonomy to those various states. In that, you find not only a fragility to the Union. After all, a braided cord of rope will hold stronger than a single string of rope. But you find, moreover, the great danger of dividing a set of spirits amongst themselves with no sense of coercion to bind them together. In our war for independence, we were united by security and goodwill. When we achieved our independence, we were united by goodwill alone. How far has that gotten mankind in society since the beginning of time? And so you see not only that, but you see states making treaties with various powers, treaties that contradict one another. Oftentimes, you see states having to violate the Articles of Confederation to work in collaboration betwixt other states. For instance, the business between Virginia and Maryland on the establishing of a Potomac Canal. What you should truly see, inevitably, is a Europe in another form, where petty animosities betwixt and across state lines should lead to constant war, constant act of open rebellion. And so, in binding the various powers together, not only through law, but in the common interest of union, you see state identity continue to pervade. You see an extended republican form of government, but you see a greater spirit pervading over all of that, which is a devotion to the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, so that our government can ever be of a mixed nature. We can ever be Virginians, Pennsylvanians, but first and foremost, Americans. Let it always be said that the people of America may be both.
Awesome. Okay, a next question for you, and I absolutely love this question from Vicky. Can you tell us about your frenemy relationship with Alexander Hamilton?
If I must. Hamilton and I's collaboration began in the early 1780s, and it was built upon the grounds and upon the necessity of some stronger union. We endeavored together collectively to put forward the business in Annapolis in 1786, and both he and I collectively, in collaborating with General Washington, spent a great many times endeavoring to ask the questions that could guide America through this wilderness. And now it is equally said that during the Constitutional Convention, I was the ear to a great many of Mr. Hamilton's frustrations. He, being a delegate from New York, faced highly anti-federal sentiment. It is why at one point he would leave the convention for a period of time. Now, Mr. Hamilton is a host unto himself. We might all remember that particular day in June when the debates were taking place between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, that Mr. Hamilton famously held the floor for 6 hours speaking upon his ideal form of government. Now, we know what those ideas were: the reduction of states to corporations, a commercial system similar to that of England, a presidency that would be inherited possibly from father to son. Now, these are extreme examples. These are controversial examples. I have often wondered whether what this was Mr. Hamilton's true intent or ideal of a system of government, or if he was playing everyone in the room, putting forward a system of government that seemed so incredibly radical that my Virginia plan, by comparison, was moderate. And is it any wonder that the following day, the Virginia plan was adopted? Only Mr. Hamilton will know.
But what a brilliant strategy. Okay, so one final question, because I can't help myself, but I think I see a telescope behind you. So can you enlighten us, no pun intended, it's a telescope, it uses light to see. Could you enlighten us about why considered the father of the Constitution would also enjoy telescopes?
I have ever had a vested interest in natural philosophy, what you call science. The whole of the world has been invested in this. We live in an age many call the Enlightenment, an era of Isaac Newton, his treatises upon gravity. We live in an age of discovering law versus simple theorem. Now, from my earliest education, I have been invested upon these matters scientific. I recall one of the earliest drawings in my tutelage under Donald Robertson in school at King and Queen County, as I was a young boy, ages 11 to 16 in that school, was a drawing of Copernicus's solar system. Understanding that we are all part of a much more astronomical republic of satellite and star. 1779, we see the introduction of the seventh planet of our solar system. Equally, we understand the transit of these various things, the movement of them, allowing us to better understand our place here with measures of things like latitude, longitude, trigonometry. I was ever envious of my worthy friend Jefferson in his time in France, which was so much more central to those scientific experiments taking place. The alchemical mixture of hydrogen allowing a stitched silk bag to float. We are discovering things at a pace never before seen. And in this, we create a system of self-government that mirrors that. And so when we look to our own extended republic, what do we see within our solar system? We see a supreme celestial sun navigating and coercing these seven planets in harmony to keep them from drifting apart, or worse, colliding. We see in the evidence of our own time that as we begin to understand and fathom the world around us, additional planets may be introduced into our solar system. We see a sun that is both supreme but derivative and limited in its powers, allowing for the sustaining upon life on our globe, but not interfering to the point that life should become incompatible. There are equally treatises where some speculate what life might be like upon other planets. Life upon our moon, upon Mercury, upon Venus, And who is to say? I know not whether man should ever go there. That is a fantasy in and of itself. But is this not a perfect system for a federative system of government? A great many things can be understood by natural order. After all, look to the philosophers who are writing their treatises upon natural law, the various laws and rights and government that are taught to all animals, but man being a unique creature bound inevitably with reason, gets to take these various examples from nature and apply it to the mechanisms of government. I have ever been fascinated with nature. I think America's nature is one of its greatest virtues. It is why I've begun to fill my rooms within my family's estate with figures of the falls of Niagara, of the natural rock formations of Virginia. Now, this telescope is one sent by my worthy friend, Mr. Jefferson. I asked when he was in France if he might procure me a walking stick with a telescope affixed to the top for my own ramblings in the wood. I suspect such a thing was difficult to find, and he settled for this here.
That's amazing. And now we have homework this weekend to ponder the Constitution while walking through nature, which I know is something Jeff and I both absolutely love. So with that, I want to just thank you so much for such a great class and bringing in the reading, the English, the Constitution, the government, and science all into one quick half hour. So thank you so much. It was wonderful. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you for final thoughts, but I'm sure that really enlightened your brain to how you're gonna go for hiking this weekend.
Well, enlightening is exactly the right word, as our chat suggests. Brilliant and inspiring, one of the most knowledgeable speakers we've ever heard. And Mr. Madison for so brightly encapsulating the need to achieve personal as well as political self-government in order to find a harmony of the spheres in our minds, among the branches of our government, and with the natural laws of the universe. I want to thank you very sincerely on behalf of the National Constitution Center. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and for inspiring all of us to continue to cultivate our faculties of reason. And have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you, Mr. Madison.
Thank you so much. Great conversation. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.